في الله بيحسب، في قضاء بيحسب. راح أسعى إلا ما أجيبه مع المحكمة وأخذ حقي بالقانون.
In 2011, Syrians filled the streets demanding freedom. Bashar al-Assad's answer was bullets, bombs, and chemical weapons. His crackdown plunged the country into one of the bloodiest wars of the century. These are 8 dictators who brutally murdered their own people.
One of the darkest periods of history. At least 800,000 people were slaughtered in the Rwanda genocide, a chain of atrocities that began when the aircraft carrying the then President Juvénal Habyarimana was shot down.
April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwandan President Juvénal Habyarimana is shot down as it approaches Kigali. This was the moment the country plunged into chaos. This single event would ignite one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century, a meticulously planned campaign of ethnic slaughter that shocked the world and left nearly 1 million dead. Juvénal Habyarimana didn't start out as a murderous dictator. 1937, he was born in what is now Rwanda's Gisenyi province. He rose through military ranks before seizing power in a 1973 coup. His regime began by banning all political activity, but evolved into a single-party state centered on the National Revolutionary Movement for Development, an organization he controlled with an iron fist. For nearly 2 decades, Habyarimana ruled Rwanda through a blend of calculated oppression and strategic favor. His government favored his fellow Hutu, an ethnic group from the northwestern regions. This group would later become the architects of genocide. Initially, violence against the Tutsi, a minority ethnic group, was limited under Habyarimana's rule compared to previous decades. But resentment toward them never really disappeared. The situation between them and the Hutus was like a fire waiting for a spark. That spark came in 1990, when the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or the RPF, a rebel group made up mostly of Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier waves of persecution, invaded Rwanda from neighboring Uganda. The invasion reopened old wounds and deepened division. Instead of seeking peace, Habyarimana's government leaned into fear. His administration began spreading hateful propaganda against the Tutsi, portraying them as enemies within, and violence against the group started to rise once again. But what began as political maneuvering soon transformed into systematic oppression. The government introduced identity cards that labeled every citizen by ethnicity, making it impossible for Tutsi people to hide who they were. Strict quotas followed, capping how many Tutsi could attend schools or hold government jobs. These policies pushed them further to the margins of society and quietly set the stage for something far more deadly. By 1993, international pressure forced Habyarimana to sign the Arusha Accords, promising power sharing with the RPF. But hardliners in his administration viewed this as betrayal. Plans for mass violence accelerated while the world watched, oblivious to what was coming.
ubwo bariyeri twashyizeho bahise baduha amabwiriza yuko umututsi uzagiye uhahita.
In the capital and beyond, Habyarimana's supporters distributed weapons. Radio stations pumped out hate-filled propaganda, labeling Tutsis as cockroaches to be exterminated. When the president's plane was shot down, these plans sprang into action with terrifying speed. Within hours, roadblocks appeared across Kigali. Militia and ordinary citizens alike checked identity cards. Those labeled Tutsi were executed on the spot. The killings spread rapidly from the capital to the countryside. Habyarimana's death became the pretext for genocide, but the machinery of mass murder was already in place. His regime had spent years preparing ordinary Rwandans for this moment. Weapons were distributed under the guise of civil defense. Local officials compiled lists of targets. The killing campaign wasn't just spontaneous mob violence. It was systematic, organized, and directed from the highest levels of government. Soldiers and militia led the first attacks, often using grenades and machine guns. As they swept through villages, they forced ordinary Hutu civilians to join the slaughter, often under threat of death themselves. What made matters worse was that the international response was slow and inadequate. The United Nations reduced its peacekeeping force instead of reinforcing it. France, a longtime supporter of Habyarimana's regime, launched Operation Turquoise, a controversial military intervention that many believe allowed key perpetrators to escape justice. By the time it ended 100 days later, between 500,000 and 800,000, people were dead, mostly Tutsi, but also moderate Hutu who opposed the killing. Juvénal Habyarimana's legacy is one of calculated evil. His regime perfected the use of administrative structures for genocidal purposes. They turned schools, churches, and hospitals, places of refuge, into slaughterhouses. By co-opting local officials, they ensured that killing was organized and thorough. The aftermath of his regime's crimes still shapes Rwanda today. While the country has rebuilt under new leadership, the scars of genocide remain. The mechanisms Habyarimana put in place, identity cards, administrative structures, propaganda, have been dismantled or fundamentally transformed. But the memory of how easily modern institutions can be twisted into tools of mass murder serves as a constant warning. But if you think this was the worst example of a leader turning against their own people, wait until you hear about the next dictator.
Reports of a new and deadly crackdown by North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. He's said to have ordered the executions of 15 people this year, including senior officials forced to face the firing squad for challenging his authority.
2011, when Kim Jong-un took power, the world expected change, but few anticipated just how dark that change would have become. Under his rule, North Korea has seen a brutal wave of executions, with hundreds and hundreds of people put to death, including 140 senior government officials. These are not just numbers. They are stories of power, fear, and absolute control within the Hermit Kingdom. The pattern began almost immediately. In 2013, Kim's first major purge was the shocking execution of his own uncle, Jang Song-taek. Jang, once considered the regime's number 2, was accused of treason and quickly eliminated. But this was only the beginning of Kim's campaign to consolidate power through terror. The pattern of purges isn't new in North Korea. Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather used similar tactics to maintain their grip on power. However, the current leader has taken things even further. In a particularly grim example, Kim ordered the execution of 30 officials after devastating floods struck the country in 2024. The officials were held responsible for the disaster, which killed thousands. It's not exactly clear what specific failures led to the execution of these officials. But Kim Jong-un had wanted the message to be unmistakable. Any failure, real or perceived, can result in the ultimate punishment. But the brutality doesn't stop with political figures. The regime's reach extends into every aspect of North Korean life. Executions have been ordered for things as simple as distributing South Korean media, drinking alcohol from a wine glass, and even wearing certain hairstyles or what they consider capitalist fashion. Kim's methods of execution are also particularly brutal. In one notorious case, he reportedly had Defense Minister Hyun Yong-chol executed with anti-aircraft guns for showing disrespect, possibly by falling asleep in a meeting. Satellite imagery later showed what appeared to be a firing range used for this gruesome purpose.
It's a pretty risky proposition to be in the upper reaches of the regime there. When we see these sorts of very high-ranking people bumped off like this, there might be a group who feel that they're better off under a different leadership.
Not only that, but the regime doesn't just kill. It makes a spectacle of death. Public executions are used to instill fear and demonstrate the consequences of disloyalty. Entire towns are sometimes forced to witness these killings. During these events, factories, farms, and marketplaces shut down as anyone who could walk was ordered to attend. In one documented case, 25,000 people were reportedly gathered to watch an execution.
I personally even experienced watching public execution. I was only 11 around.
The purges have extended even to cultural figures. In one case, 4 orchestra members were executed for alleged espionage. These killings serve as reminders that no one, regardless of their role or status, is immune to the regime's wrath. They have also used executions as a tool of collective punishment. In some cases, entire families have been killed for the actions of a single member, reinforcing the idea that loyalty to the state must come before everything else. What makes Kim's reign of terror particularly chilling is its unpredictability. The rules are constantly changing, and the penalties for breaking them are always severe. Activities that were once merely frowned upon, like watching foreign films and TV or listening to prohibited music like K-pop, are now grounds for execution. This deliberate uncertainty keeps everyone on edge, never sure if today will be the day they fall victim to the regime's next purge. And that's what sets Kim Jong-un apart from other dictators, as he uses executions as a tool of control, not just to eliminate threats. And this strategy has been terrifyingly effective in maintaining his absolute power over North Korea. But Kim Jong-un isn't the only leader infamous for brutal purges. The next dictator on our list stands as proof.
These are the first pictures of Timisoara to reach the West since last weekend. They show police and the public on the streets and some of the damage done in the rioting.
December 17, 1989, gunfire erupted in Timisoara, Romania, as soldiers opened fire on an unarmed crowd. Word spread quickly. The Romanian dictator has finally ordered bloodshed against his own people. For 24 years, Nicolae Ceaușescu ruled Romania with iron-fisted control and a cult of personality that rivaled any in the Eastern Bloc. Now his carefully constructed world of fear and surveillance was beginning to unravel. 1995, Ceaușescu's rise to power started when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party. Initially, he appeared as a reformer, easing censorship and gaining Western support by openly condemning Soviet aggression in Czechoslovakia. But by the early 1970s, he had shifted radically, imposing ideas from Communist China under Mao Zedong. He tightened control, pushed harsh policies, and built one of the largest secret police forces in Eastern Europe. The regime's control was absolute. The Securitate, Ceaușescu's secret police, maintained a web of informants so dense that some estimate 1 in 4 Romanians was involved in surveillance or reporting on their neighbors. Dissent of any kind was ruthlessly crushed. People learned quickly that even casual criticism of the regime could result in imprisonment, torture, or worse. As the 1980s began, Ceaușescu's obsession with repaying Romania's foreign debts led to draconian austerity measures. The country was plunged into severe shortages of food, electricity, heating, and even basic medical supplies, which became luxuries for ordinary Romanians. Meanwhile, the dictator and his wife Elena lived in luxurious palaces, including the infamous Spring Palace with its gold-plated bathroom fixtures and extravagant indoor pool. By late 1989, change was sweeping Eastern Europe. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Communist regimes were collapsing, but Ceaușescu refused to acknowledge reality. He watched nervously as other leaders were forced from power, determined not to share their fate. The breaking point came in December, when the regime's attempt to cover up the massacre, where over 1,000 people were killed, failed as news spread rapidly. On December 21st, Ceaușescu staged a massive rally in Bucharest, intending to demonstrate his control. But the carefully orchestrated event turned into a disaster when crowds began heckling him, shouting Timisoara, and booing his attempts to placate them with minor concessions. As the situation deteriorated, Ceaușescu and his wife fled Bucharest by helicopter, desperately trying to find loyal forces. But the army had turned against him, and soon the forces that once protected his regime now arrested the dictator and his wife, ending their bid to escape justice. December 25, 1989, the trial of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was both quick and brutal. In just 55 minutes, they were found guilty of genocide, subverting state power, destroying public property, undermining the national economy, and attempting to flee Romania with public funds. The verdict was predetermined: execution. Those involved later admitted the court proceedings were not just but necessary. Hundreds of soldiers volunteered for the firing squad, and the executioners even fired without waiting for official orders. The Ceaușescus were struck by 120 bullets, ending 24 years of oppressive rule. Their deaths marked the only violent overthrow of a communist regime in Eastern Europe during the 1989 revolutions. But the legacy of Ceaușescu's brutality remains complex. Thousands of people were killed and wounded during the revolution, but the exact number of victims from his rule, including those tortured, imprisoned, or killed, may never be known. Even today, many Romanians struggle with the trauma of those years. Distrust of government institutions continues among Romanians to this day, fueled by decades of repression and surveillance. But Romania isn't the only nation scarred by a ruthless dictator. The next on our list left behind ruins that still bleed today.
وسنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر، بيت بيت، دار دار، زنقة زنقة، فرد فرد.
April 7th, 1977, Libya witnessed one of its darkest days. Thousands of students had been arrested simply for speaking out against Muammar Gaddafi's regime. That day in Benghazi, many of them were dragged before crowds and executed in public. The horror didn't stop there. The executions were broadcast live on national television, forcing the entire country to watch. For Gaddafi's government, it was meant as a warning. They called it the Day of Judgment, a chilling message that dissent would not be tolerated. For ordinary Libyans, it was a day of fear and heartbreak, when voices calling for freedom were silenced before their families, neighbors, and the nation's eyes. Just 8 years earlier, Gaddafi had swept into power on promises of freedom, socialism, and unity. His bloodless 1969 coup, ousting King Idris, was initially hailed as a revolution by a young, charismatic army officer and his group of free officers. But beneath the surface, a machinery of terror and oppression was already taking shape. Gaddafi's early years saw him leveraging Libya's newly negotiated oil wealth to give the country a taste of rapid development, building schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects that quickly raised living standards. But even as Libya modernized, the mechanisms of repression multiplied. Political parties disappeared, trade unions were banned, and the country fell under a blanket of tight surveillance. Gaddafi even wrote his own political manifesto, the Green Book, which he forced every Libyan to read. In it, he dismissed elections, calling them nothing more than dictatorship by the biggest party, and instead pushed his idea of people's committees. On paper, these committees were supposed to give ordinary citizens a voice. In practice, they had no real power at all. Every decision still came down to Gaddafi and his small circle of loyalists. By the late 1970s, the regime's true character emerged. Public executions became regular spectacles, with school students forced to attend as a lesson in obedience. A network of secret police and informants stifled dissent. And Gaddafi's revolutionary committees, manned by radicalized youth loyal to the regime, operated as ideological enforcers and instruments of terror. Any opposition, real or imagined, was crushed with ruthless efficiency. The infamous Abu Salam prison became a symbol of Gaddafi's brutality, housing thousands of political prisoners in horrific conditions. In 1996, during a protest over food and prison conditions, more than 1,200 inmates were massacred, gunned down in courtyards, and buried in unmarked graves. The regime kept this atrocity secret for 5 years, while families continued bringing food to the prison, unaware their loved ones were already dead. Gaddafi's reach extended far beyond Libya's borders. He became a patron of international terrorism, supporting militant groups around the world and targeting Libyan exiles for assassination. His paranoia knew no bounds. Even British and American citizens fell victim to attacks orchestrated by his agents. The regime's brutality wasn't limited to political opponents. Gaddafi systematically targeted Libya's ethnic minorities, especially the Amazigh or Berber people. Their language was banned, their villages destroyed, and their culture erased from public life. Gaddafi's regime described these minorities as the children of Satan and sought to Arabize their identities through coercion and violence. Gaddafi's security forces perfected torture techniques, often in collaboration with Western intelligence agencies during the so-called War on Terror. Suspects were rendered to Libya, where they faced waterboarding, electrocution, and other forms of brutal interrogation. During the 2011 uprising, Gaddafi's forces responded to peaceful protests with tanks and live ammunition. In the eastern cities of Benghazi, Al-Baida, Derna, and Tobruk, hundreds of unarmed civilians were killed, with many crushed by tanks or shot in the head, neck, and chest. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, while government forces blocked ambulances from reaching the wounded.
بدل ما تكونوا معانا تكونوا ضدنا لمصلحة من؟ بالله لمصلحة من؟ قد تندمون يوم لا ينفع الندم الذي بيته من الزجاج لا يرجم الناس بالحجارة.
Entire cities faced collective punishment. Gaddafi's troops bombarded civilian areas with heavy weapons, including illegal cluster munitions. In Misrata, a 4-month siege resulted in hundreds of civilian deaths, as water supplies were deliberately contaminated and food supplies cut off. In 2011, one of the most barbaric episodes of violence occurred at the Yarmouk military base. Guards from the Kamas Brigade locked 153 detainees, mostly civilians, in a warehouse, then opened fire from the roof while throwing grenades inside. Survivors recounted being forced to repeat the Shahada with Gaddafi's name and to refer to him as God. 45 detainees were confirmed killed, but many more remain missing. The regime's forces also used as a weapon of war. Over 8,000 cases were reported during the conflict, with systematic violence employed to terrorize communities. When the end finally came in October 2011, Gaddafi's death was as violent as his rule had been. Captured by rebel forces, he was beaten and killed. Then his body was displayed in Misrata for 4 days, before being buried in an unmarked grave in the desert.
This is a Libya that for the first time in 42 years does not have to live in fear of Muammar Gaddafi. He is gone for good, and few, if any, are mourning his passing.
But Gaddafi's legacy of violence and division continues to haunt Libya. The institutions of terror he created left deep scars on the nation. More than a decade after his death, Libya still struggles to overcome the trauma of his brutal regime. The next dictator on our list also terrorized his people for decades and left the country struggling to this day.
Afterwards, some celebrated in the streets. In the Baghdad slum of Sadr City, some paraded an effigy of Saddam hanging from the front of a truck.
2006, when Saddam Hussein's execution footage first aired in Baghdad, the city erupted and cheering filled the air. For many Iraqis, this was the moment they'd waited decades for, a dictator finally facing justice. But the story of how Iraq reached this day is a dark tapestry woven from power, brutality, and relentless control. Saddam Hussein's rise began with calculated ambition. Born in 1937 near Tikrit, he endured a harsh childhood as he was abandoned by his mother and beaten by his stepfather. These early traumas hardened him, fueling a personality that would later dominate Iraq with iron resolve. By his teens, Saddam had joined the Ba'ath Party, immersing himself in Arab nationalism and revolutionary politics. Saddam Hussein's rise to power was both ruthless and calculated. In 1959, he took part in a failed attempt to assassinate Iraq's president. Instead of being disgraced, Saddam twisted the failure into a tale of bravery, turning himself into a hero in the eyes of supporters. From there, he seized every opportunity, using fear, intimidation, and violence to climb through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party, step by step, until nothing stood in his way. Then, July 1979 marked a turning point as he took his ruthlessness even further. Just 5 days into his presidency, Saddam convened a meeting of senior officials. On national television, he accused dozens of treason and had them dragged away for execution. This spectacle wasn't just about eliminating enemies. It was a chilling warning to anyone who dared oppose him. But Saddam understood that fear alone wouldn't sustain his rule. He implemented sweeping social reforms, including universal health care, free education, and expanded rights for women. These policies built a foundation of public support, cushioning his growing authoritarianism. By the early 1980s, Saddam faced mounting threats from both within and beyond Iraq's borders. The Iran-Iraq War, launched in 1980, drained the nation's resources and left hundreds of thousands dead. But it also provided cover for internal purges and the solidification of his power. Saddam's regime developed a sophisticated security apparatus, including secret police, informant networks, and brutal paramilitary groups. One Western diplomat said,
"There is a feeling that at least 3 million Iraqis are watching the 11 million others."
No one was truly safe. Everyone was potentially suspect. His response to dissent was swift and merciless. In 1982, after an assassination attempt in Juvénal, Saddam ordered the killing of 148 Shia villagers and the destruction of their homes. This event would later become the centerpiece of his war crimes trial. But his most infamous campaign was the Anfal genocide against the Kurdish population. Between 1986 and 1989, approximately 100,000 Tatars, Kurds, were killed. The 1988 chemical attack on Halabja alone claimed up to 5,000 lives in a single day. As international pressure mounted, Saddam's paranoia grew. He purged anyone suspected of disloyalty, including close family members. His sons, Uday and Kusai, became notorious for their own cruelty, furthering the regime's culture of fear. By the late 1990s, international sanctions had devastated Iraq's economy. While ordinary families struggled with poverty, Saddam poured resources into building lavish palaces and monuments to glorify himself. For everyday Iraqis, the hardship only fueled a mix of resentment, despair, and fear. But Saddam's downfall would come not from within, but from abroad. The 2003 US-led invasion toppled his regime, ending 24 years of brutal rule. His capture, trial, and execution marked the end of an era and the beginning of new, equally complex chapters in Iraq's history. In Sadr City, crowds paraded Saddam's effigy through the streets, celebrating what felt like the end of a nightmare. For many, it was a moment of long-awaited freedom. Yet not everyone danced in the streets. Others mourned him, clinging to the belief that he had been a symbol of strength and resistance.
This man says Saddam's execution is an honor to all Iraqis. He says Saddam was a historical hero and will be remembered as a man who confronted the occupation and the Americans.
Saddam Hussein's rule left behind a legacy of fear, trauma, and deep divisions. His brutality was cold and calculated, a clear example of how absolute power can corrupt completely. Even today, the scars of his regime are etched across Iraq, a lasting reminder of the true cost of tyranny. Saddam's rule was brutal, but on another continent, Uganda faced its own nightmare.
But is it true that you said Hitler didn't kill enough Jews during the war?
January 1971, soldiers loyal to General Idi Amin stormed government buildings in Uganda's capital, Kampala, in a military coup. Within hours, Amin seizes power from President Milton Obote, promising a return to civilian rule. But the world would soon learn just how empty that promise was. Amin's rise started with good intentions, or so it seemed. Many Ugandans welcomed his takeover, hoping for unity after years of political tension. Even Western nations, suspicious of Obote's left-leaning policies, initially supported the new regime. But that optimism quickly faded as Amin's true nature came to light. Within weeks, Amin began consolidating power through fear and violence. He targeted anyone loyal to Obote, especially senior army officers from rival ethnic groups. Political opponents vanished without a trace, and the once stable nation descended into a nightmare of paranoia and brutality. Amin's reign of terror wasn't limited to political rivals. He unleashed his secret police, the State Research Bureau, on everyday citizens. Ordinary Ugandans lived in constant fear of midnight knocks on their doors. Many never returned home. Surveillance became a way of life, and trust among neighbors evaporated. The dictator's paranoia grew with each passing month. He saw enemies everywhere, real or imagined. His security forces killed between $100,000 and 500,000 people, according to human rights groups. Bodies often washed up on the shores of Lake Victoria. Amin's persecution extended beyond political opponents. He targeted entire ethnic groups, particularly the Asholi and Langji, killing thousands in a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Religious leaders weren't spared either. The Anglican Archbishop Janani Luwum and other prominent clerics were murdered for speaking out against his regime. Not only that, but the dictator's policies devastated Uganda's economy. In 1972, Amin expelled over 60,000 Asians, many of whom were successful business owners. He claimed it was to give Ugandans control of their economy, but the real motive was to eliminate perceived threats and seize their assets. The result was economic collapse and widespread poverty. Amin's erratic behavior extended to international relations. He broke ties with Israel, then turned to Libya and the Soviet Union for support. He declared himself conqueror of the British Empire after the UK severed diplomatic relations. His bizarre titles grew with his ego, including President for Life and Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the seas.
The whole army, air force, marine, all security forces, including Uganda, will be in alert from now. And we are ready to combat any British will be coming across.
But Amin's brutality knew no bounds. Witnesses reported that he kept heads in his freezer and even boasted about them. What's more, torture chambers in the State Research Bureau became sites of unimaginable horror. Survivors spoke of beatings, starvation, and watching fellow prisoners die slowly. April 1979, the dictator's reign finally ended when Tanzanian forces invaded Uganda. Amin fled into exile, first to Libya and then Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. He never faced justice for his crimes. Uganda's wounds ran deep after Amin's departure. An entire generation grew up knowing only violence, fear, and distrust. The nation's economy lay in ruins, and its people were traumatized by years of brutality. But despite the lingering scars, Uganda slowly rebuilt, determined never to repeat its dark past. Amin's legacy remains one of the bloodiest chapters in African history. But sadly, it's not the last.
For more than a decade, Omar al-Bashir has been wanted by the International Criminal Court on charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, torture, and genocide in the Darfur region.
April 2019, General Omar al-Bashir's 30-year grip on Sudan ended with a military coup. Crowds poured into the streets, celebrating the removal of a dictator whose rule had plunged their country into chaos, violence, and division. But as the dust settled, the true cost of Bashir's legacy and the horrors he unleashed across Sudan began to come fully into focus. 1989, Bashir's rise began when he led a military coup that ousted a democratically elected government. He quickly consolidated power, aligning himself with hardline Islamists and dissolving parliament. By the 1990s, Sudan had become a haven for terrorist groups, including hosting Osama bin Laden before his rise to global infamy. His regime's brutality would soon reach its peak in Darfur, a name that would become synonymous with genocide. 2003, the Sudanese government's long-standing neglect and discrimination against Darfur's non-Arab population erupted into open rebellion. Bashir responded with overwhelming force, unleashing government troops and the notorious Janjaweed militia against civilian populations. Villages were burned to the ground. Women and children were slaughtered or driven from their homes. By conservative estimates, between 200,000 and 400,000 people died, and millions were displaced in what the International Criminal Court would call a campaign of mass killing and pillage.
The government deceived us. They made us flee from our lands. We knew with time that they have no principles. Whenever we move, we are killed.
2009, the International Criminal Court issued its first warrant for Bashir's arrest, charging him with war crimes and crimes against humanity. A second warrant followed in 2010, adding 3 counts of genocide, making Bashir the first sitting head of state ever indicted by the ICC for such charges. Despite these charges, Bashir remained defiant. He continued to travel internationally, protected by sympathetic governments and regional alliances. The African Union condemned the ICC's warrants, claiming they targeted African leaders unfairly. Meanwhile, violence continued in Darfur, and Bashir's regime maintained its grip on power through fear and corruption. Bashir's rule brought economic collapse as well. By 2012, inflation reached crisis levels, the currency collapsed, the infrastructure also crumbled, and basic services disappeared. 2018, the breaking point came when economic desperation finally sparked widespread protests, which Bashir tried to crush through violence and intimidation. But the movement only grew stronger. In April 2019, after months of unrest, the military finally removed Bashir from power. He was arrested and eventually convicted of corruption, but the deeper crimes, like his responsibility for genocide and mass murder, remained unprosecuted. That's why Sudan's transitional government faced immediate pressure to hand Bashir over to the ICC. International pressure mounted, and in 2020, the new government agreed to surrender Bashir to face trial in The Hague. It was an unprecedented step, as no former head of state had ever been handed over for a genocide trial by his own country's government before. Years of investigations have produced mountains of evidence, including documents, eyewitness testimony, and forensic proof of mass graves and deliberate extermination campaigns. Omar al-Bashir's shadow still hangs over Sudan. Today's civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, a militia that grew directly out of the Janjaweed, can be traced back to his divide-and-rule strategies. The same ethnic tensions and proxy militias he once fostered are now tearing the country apart. Since 2024, the toll has been devastating. Thousands have been killed, countless others forced to flee as refugees into neighboring countries like Chad and Egypt, and those left behind face brutal violence and one of the worst famines the country has ever seen.
We have found that the Sudanese warring parties have committed an appalling range of violations. We found reasonable grounds to believe that many of these violations amount to international crimes.
Bashir's legacy still haunts Sudan, but in the Middle East, another ruler has left a trail of destruction and a death toll in the hundreds of thousands.
Either the terrorists had chemical weapons and they used it intentionally, or there was no attack at all.
May 2011, as protests spread across the Arab world during the Arab Spring, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad dismissed the growing opposition to his rule as nothing more than a farce. But his words were only the beginning. What followed was a brutal crackdown that spiraled into one of the deadliest civil wars of the 21st century. Born September 11, 1965, Bashar al-Assad never intended to lead Syria. His older brother Bashar was supposed to inherit power from their father, the infamous Hafez al-Assad, another brutal dictator. But Bashar's death in a car crash forced Bashar into the brutal world of Syrian politics. By 2000, he inherited the presidency, quickly building a security state even more repressive than his father's. Within a year, hopeful reformers demanding transparency and democracy were silenced. The so-called Damascus Spring ended with hundreds of arrests, rollbacks of political freedoms, and the continuation of the 1963 emergency law that gave Assad nearly unlimited power. The security apparatus expanded, secret police monitored every movement, and the country became a police state. Assad's regime established a complex web of loyalist networks, dominated by his Alawite clan. Nepotism and corruption took over every part of the country, especially through his cousin Rami Makhlouf, who controlled nearly everything related to the economy. These policies alienated urban and rural populations, creating deep social divides that would later fuel the 2011 revolution. But before that, there were other tensions throughout the years, including the 2005 assassination of former Lebanese Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, which led to massive protests dubbed the Cedar Revolution. International pressure forced Assad to withdraw Syrian troops from Lebanon after 29 years of occupation. The United Nations investigation directly implicated his inner circle in the assassination. By 2011, the Arab Spring reached Syria after being successful in Tunisia and Egypt. Peaceful protests calling for reform were met with deadly force. Assad's security forces opened fire on demonstrators, igniting a nationwide uprising. As the death toll mounted, the regime doubled down with even greater brutality. Security forces arrested, tortured, and killed thousands of suspected opponents. The conflict escalated into a full-scale civil war. Assad's forces targeted civilian areas with indiscriminate shelling, airstrikes, and later, chemical weapons. Barrel bombs in the form of crude, explosive-filled containers dropped from helicopters became a symbol of his regime's disregard for civilian life. August 2013, the world was horrified by the chemical weapons attack on Ghouta. Assad's forces launched sarin gas rockets into civilian neighborhoods, killing up to 1,500 people, including hundreds of children. Despite international outrage and evidence, Assad denied responsibility, calling it a fabrication. This wasn't an isolated incident. The Syrian Network for Human Rights documented 217 chemical attacks by the regime, killing 1,514 people and injuring over 11,000. Barrel bombs dropped from helicopters killed at least 11,000 more civilians.
When the attack happened, people started choking and couldn't breathe. My wife and children were killed by chemical bombs, he says.
Not only that, but the regime's torture prisons became infamous, especially the infamous Sednaya prison, dubbed the human slaughterhouse. Witnesses described horrific abuse, including electrocution, beatings, and sexual violence. At least $15,000 people died under torture, including 190 children and 95 women.
من ايدي وايدي الثانيه لفوق بيوقفوني يعني بيرفعوني عن الارض على رؤوس اصابعي يروح يجيب الكهرباء ويكهربني وانا مشبوحه وقت اللي اغماء مشان اصحى.
Assad's forces also deliberately targeted hospitals, schools, and civilian infrastructure. Over 600 medical facilities were attacked and nearly 1,000 medical workers were killed. Humanitarian access was systematically blocked, creating starvation sieges in opposition-held areas. The regime's scorched earth tactics caused the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Over 12 million Syrians, more than half the pre-war population, were displaced, including 6.8 million refugees. Assad's demographic engineering campaigns forcibly displaced Sunni populations and repopulated areas with loyalist supporters. International efforts to hold Assad accountable were consistently blocked by Russia and Iran, his primary backers, despite overwhelming evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Assad maintained power through ruthless violence and foreign support. But everything changed in December 2024.
Syrian President Bashar al-Assad flees the capital as rebel forces storm into Damascus. The rebels declare the city free from Assad's decades-long rule.
A coordinated rebel offensive swept through regime-held territory. Assad's forces collapsed under the pressure and defections accelerated. As rebels closed in on Damascus, Assad fled to Russia, seeking asylum in Moscow. December 8, 2024, after 54 years of Assad family rule, Damascus fell. The regime's security apparatus collapsed, and the city erupted in celebration. Syrians poured into the streets, defacing Assad's images and embracing the end of decades of oppression. The new transitional authorities declared their intent to prosecute Bashar al-Assad for his crimes against humanity. International arrest warrants were issued, and the world finally started to see justice taking shape. But the scars of Assad's rule remain deep. Over 202 lost, civilians were killed, nearly 100,000 disappeared, and millions were displaced. The destruction of Syria's social fabric and infrastructure will take generations to repair. Yet, for the first time in decades, Syrians can speak openly about the horrors they endured. Justice may finally be within reach for the victims of one of the 21st century's most brutal dictators.